this was the kind of economy where people got themselves into debt all the time, right? Debt was a big issue in ancient Mesopotamia. How did that happen?
It was a very big issue because people were paying their rents, they were paying their taxes, and they had to pay those. And sometimes their fields didn't produce enough grain in order to provide that. And so the obvious thing to do would be to go to someone who had more money than you and borrow the money to pay your taxes. And then when the harvest happened, at that point, you could then pay the person back, ideally. Unfortunately, the standard interest rate on grain was 33.33%. And that was due whenever you paid it.
That's very high.
It's very high.
And were they paying that in grain or in money? Were there actual coins?
It varied. They didn't have coinage yet. They paid some things in silver, but they would weigh the silver on a scale. So a person would keep his wealth in a coil of silver, which you would, clip a piece off the coil and then weigh it, and that would be paying in silver. But most people were much more likely to pay in grain. The problem with that is the king didn't really want that much grain coming into his palace. It was incredibly heavy. It was very hard to ship. And therefore, he wanted some middleman to turn that into silver for him. And this is where one gets the people who were really central to this debt issue, who were usually merchants who had a lot of wealth. And the people would pay their taxes that were collected by this person who was called the overseer of the merchants. He would then somehow turn that into silver. And this is unfortunately the part of the system that we don't really see exactly how it happened. But he would sell those commodities to get silver, which he would then send to the king. So the king gets his taxes and rents in a fairly easy format for him to use.
Right.
Whereas people weren't responsible for trying to turn their own grain into silver ahead of time.
So what happens if people couldn't pay back their debts? I mean, we hear stories about people selling themselves into slavery or selling their kids into slavery to pay back their debts. But was that common?
It was. People did get themselves into terrible debt. And often there was a sort of pledge against the debt. So they would pledge their house or their field. And sometimes they would pledge their family as a sort of guarantee against the repayment. And so they would lose access sometimes to their farm, which of course then made it much more difficult to get to pay back the debt because they've lost control of their farm. And sometimes they would indeed, their family members or the debtor himself would become a debt slave of the person to whom they owed the money.
But he would sell his wife and children before he'd sell himself into slavery.
Yes. Yeah.
That gives a whole new sense of debt crises. It really does.
It really is. And it wasn't chattel slavery. Debt slavery was different because there was an end point to it. There was a point at which it was considered that the debt had been worked off by the people who had been working for the lender. But it was years. And so that meant that person was functionally enslaved for several years. And this also then created a crisis because you have a situation where the king is sort of losing control of his own economy because the entrepreneurs to whom he has delegated the collection of the taxes and the collection of the interest on them and so forth, those people are now basically usurping some of the manpower that he would otherwise have working for him. They're working for the lenders. And this was a huge crisis for the country when too many people were in debt.
Wow. So it creates a whole new sense of a fiscal crisis.